Other political subdivisions, for instance, public libraries, townships, conservancy districts, may be reimbursed by for eligible expenses from the fund, but they're required to coordinate a reimbursement with their enabling body, which is generally the entity that approves their budget, to make the reimbursement request on behalf of the entity through either the county, city, or town. Libraries and conservancy districts and townships cannot file a reimbursement request on their own. They'll need to go through, one of the three entities that are on the approved list. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. The CRF may only be used to reimburse units of government to cover costs that are necessary expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency with respect to COVID-19. They were not accounted for in the entity's budget, most recently approved as of March 27th, 2020, which is when the enactment of the CARES Act was. Were incurred for the time period that begins on March 1st, 2020 and ends December 30, 2020. The expenditure is allowed under the guidance issued by the U.S. Department of Treasury and also as modified by the state of Indiana. You can find this information on the second page of the reimbursement request form on the IFA website. A couple of things. I know your larger lobbying group on behalf of counties is lobbying to get that December 30 date extended. At a minimum, maybe the cutoff will be December 30 for expenses, but give us some additional time to get the expenses processed, or even get a more time period. I know that's being talked about. Our Congress is on their July break, which I didn't realize their July break was 3 weeks. They'll be back in the third week of July, I believe, and have about 3 weeks to work together before they go on their summer break. We're hopeful to see some changes made to the CARES Act. And I also know there are other possible legislation out there to provide some assistance on lost revenue, which currently is not allowed under the CARES Act by the federal guidelines. Next slide, please. The eligible designated expense categories are 1, medical expenses, 2, public health expenses, 3, unforeseen payroll expenses for public safety, public health, healthcare, human services, and similar employees whose services are substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to the COVID-19 public health emergency. 4, expenses of actions to facilitate compliance with COVID-19 and related public health measures. 5, expenses that are associated with the provision of economic support to small businesses in connection with COVID-19's public health emergency. And they're limited to only costs of personal protective equipment, cleaning and sanitizing products, and measures that promote social distancing. 6, any other COVID-related expenses reasonably necessary to function the government that satisfies the CARES Act eligibility criteria. Next slide. I'm going to hand off to Jim McGough, our Chief Operating Officer and Director of Environmental Programs, to kind of walk through the details. One of the reasons the IFA volunteered to kind of be the point of contact for assist units with their reimbursement of these funds is we do a very similar program with our state revolving fund, where we have federal dollars along with our local state dollars, and we reimburse millions of dollars to local units of governments on a regular basis through this process. There's a lot of similarities we're using from our SRF program in the COVID Relief Fund program. And from there, I'll have Jim take over for Category 1 medical expenses. Jim, you may need to unmute. All right. You want to run down the hall, see what's going on? I'll start until we get Jim on a live mic. So Category 1, which is in the previous list, are COVID-19 related expenses of public hospitals, clinics, and similar facilities. Expenses of establishing temporary public medical facilities and other measures to increase COVID-19 treatment capacity, including related construction costs. We have, I think Jim is on now. Go ahead, Jim.
Thank you, Dan. And as Dan pointed out, the categories that he went through on the back of our reimbursement form. And the next few slides will go through each category in a little more detail. And out of each slide, we have listed some examples from what we have currently seen coming in to our for reimbursement. So the first category of the six, again, is medical expenses. And as you can see, they're pretty straightforward. And health facilities, temporary medical facilities, we had requests for counties, cities, and towns that want to set up testing sites and put additions on to existing medical facilities to enable drive-through testing, which would all be eligible. The lab costs associated with testing are eligible for trailers, etc. Those are the general medical categories, and we'll leave time for specific questions at the end of this if you want to bring up your specific needs. We advance.
Hey, Jim, we're getting a lot of chat saying your audio is not very good. You want to maybe walk down here and work off of my screen? I think that'll be best.
Yeah, well.
Apologize, folks. We'll give us a little break here and we'll get Jim back on so everybody can hear him, and we'll start over on the medical expense. Sorry about the technical difficulties, folks.
Thank you, Dan. So we're on slide 4. And again, we're just going into more detail on each of these 6 categories that Dan had originally highlighted. On the medical expense side, and on each one of these, we've listed some examples at the bottom of reimbursements that we've already processed. And we'll have time at the end for specific questions that you want to bring up on each one of the categories if you have any. On the medical side, pretty straightforward in any or most health care related expenses that were a direct result of the COVID-19 health emergency would be reimbursed from the program. And some of the categories at the bottom, lab costs, temporary facilities that you may need in order to set up testing centers, or additions to current centers in order to accommodate drive-through are some of the more common ones we've been seeing. You advance to the next slide, which is slide number 5. These are some specific public health expense related items. Again, most of them fairly straightforward with PPE, sanitizer. If you're going to be retrofitting your facilities to enable touchless items such as sinks, hand dryers, front door openers, etc. Any type of sign, banner, or other advertisement or directional signage to accommodate the separation and social distancing would also be eligible. Additional cleaning services that are needed and or personnel that are needed to implement those cleaning services. Slide number 6 are the unforeseen payroll expenses. And one of those items, as I just mentioned, would be the additional payroll needs for someone to take on the responsibility for the additional cleaning. We've seen this request from a couple parks department that wanted to open their outside facilities and needed to employ a temporary person for the summer months in order to take care of the constant cleaning that would come with the opening of those facilities. In addition, the need for overtime that would be associated with personnel that are having to respond or had to respond in the spring to the emergency created by COVID-19 would also be examples of items that would be reimbursable. Slide number 7. We're on to the 4th category, compliance expenses. And these predominantly fall in the enabling telework capabilities, and that would be almost anything associated with upgrading infrastructure, IT infrastructure, and or the acquisition of portable computer devices and things like that that individuals would need to work remotely. Slide number 8. Economic support for small businesses, which falls under category number 5. These would be expenses that are associated with providing local businesses, most directly with PPE related items and or items that are associated with their capital projects or retrofitting their facilities to enable social distancing is what we're seeing most of. Next slide is number 9. Some large categories that fortunately are not eligible under the CARES Act. As Dan mentioned, there are efforts on behalf of the national associations to put in place for the next stimulus package that will hopefully be coming out of DC to enable the replacement of lost revenues. We understand that that appears to be the largest need that we have heard that unfortunately we cannot take care of. The other items there are some of the questions that we've been receiving that again, the CARES Act do not enable us to reimburse. Slide number 10, a question that I know many of you have been faced with, CARES Act versus FEMA, and many of you have reached out to FEMA and they have provided good advice as far as how to navigate this. Unfortunately, both programs, there is some overlap and there is some ability that one program provides something that another program does not. The most important item for you to know is that if you do decide to utilize FEMA for your reimbursements, that 25% or your local 25% would qualify for a CARES Act reimbursement as long as what the 25% is matching also is eligible for CARES Act reimbursement. The easiest one for us to show is that the FEMA ability or date range starts with the presidential declaration of a national disaster, which I believe was either January or February, where CARES Act starts March 1. So if you're looking to reimburse expenses that predate March 1, we would not be able to provide the associated 25% match for those. But post March 1, as long as they meet the other CARES Act eligibilities, we would be able to reimburse. Slide 11 and 12 and 13 are all specific steps on how to go about seeking reimbursement. We encourage you to return the acceptance certification that was provided to each county chief executive officer, and we'll keep those on file so that when reimbursement forms come in, we can process them. If we do not have the acceptance certification, it'll delay the processing of your reimbursements, which are currently running between 8 and 10 days. So 8 to 10 days of our receipt of all of the invoice documentation we need, we are able to put wires out back to you as far as reimbursing your expenses. If there is a need to appoint another individual other than the chief executive officer, we are accepting a resolution of your enabling body that would appoint such a person, and then that individual could sign the reimbursements going forward. And with respect to reimbursements, we will accept them however you'd like to process them. If you'd like to do them periodically, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, or if you'd like to wait and accumulate all your reimbursements at one time, we can certainly take care of that as well, whatever makes sense for your individual processes. Slide 12 is what we'd consider the second step after you return the acceptance certification, is to review our website, which has answers to frequently asked questions. It's got specific directions on completing a reimbursement form, and then the reimbursement form itself is a one-page form. We believe straightforward, and the back of that form has the 6 general categories. And we would ask that you accumulate all your reimbursements by category each time you submit a reimbursement form, so that you use one form per category, and that will enable us to track the various expense categories so that we can report. We certainly are going to be reporting this up through the state ranks, but we also expect our congressional delegation to be interested into not only who is seeking reimbursement, but what general categories they are seeking their reimbursement for. Slide 13, proper documentation. We ask invoices and making notations on the invoices where appropriate to clearly document the health-related rationale for the expense being requested. Sometimes it's not completely clear by the invoice by itself. So if you can make a note on the invoice, or if you choose to use, as some communities are using, an Excel spreadsheet to summarize all of the expenses by individual county agency, and then they roll it up into one Excel looking for or summarizing all the expenses for benefit. But they also include or need to include the invoice documentation that we can go through to see the original documentation for the expense. Slide number 14 gives you the website address as well as our email address. Emails, I think we're on top of answering within 24 hours of receipt. So if you have specific questions or want to submit items for us to review before you place the final order, you can certainly do that, and we will get back to you very quickly. And then phone call always works as well. I think the phone call is on, or the proper phone number is on our website. And with that, I think we will be ready for questions.
If I could, this is Dan, if I could jump in real quick on a couple of things. For the most part, the expenses we've processed, for the most part, we have very few that we've had to deny. One of them was denied because it was an expense before March 1st. Another one was denied because the expense really didn't qualify in categories. A couple of other hurdles we're running into is an entity may send in a reimbursement form signed off by their CEO, but we don't have the certificate of participation endorsed by their CEO. And another one we run into is a reimbursement form is signed by someone besides, the CEO of your particular entity. Another one to help understand why we're looking for this documentation is ultimately the federal inspector general will be coming back to audit each state and how they utilized these funds and looking for appropriate proof. And if the documentation is not correct, they would be asking the state to return that money to the Fed. So we're trying to protect both the state of Indiana and you as a reimbursement receivee. A lot of stuff we're doing is because of the federal requirements. That it's very similar to what we do in our state revolving funds until we get federal money also. I think those are just a couple ones I wanted to add. And then, David, I'm sure you've gotten a lot of chat questions. We're willing to kind of try to work through those as best we can for you.
Sure, thanks. Hope everybody can hear me. This is David Bottorff with the Association of Counties. One of the questions is, what is the deadline to submit the agreement, the certification agreement?
No deadline on the certification, but we cannot process a reimbursement unless we have it. So we recommend you go ahead and sign it and send it back to us while you're thinking about it. But if you choose not to, it needs to accompany your first round of reimbursements. Otherwise, we'll have to reach back out to you to request that form before we can start work on your reimbursement form.
Okay. And this is David again, but under current law, this is kind of logistics. This is David talking. Since currently the program ends at the end of the calendar year, if you're going to, the state's going to want to know, is this $300 million that they've allocated to local units of government going to be used? Because if it doesn't get used, the state has to return to the federal government at the end of the calendar year under current law. So I would suspect that sometime in mid-November or something, the state may come back and say, well, if you're not going to spend your allocation, we're going to revert it back to the state so the state can spend it. Again, that's David's speculation a little bit. Don't know if Dan and those at IFA have kind of thought about that scenario yet.
I think you're accurate in your expectation that if the funds got to go back December 31st, we really need to see reimbursement requests no later than late November, early December. But I also think you're correct. If we get into October or November and there are significant balances still out there, that I would assume that we would be requested to reach out to everyone holding those significant balances to give them a tap on the shoulder to say, please spend your funds. Or I don't know if any determination would be made to reallocate, but we certainly encourage you to move forward sooner rather than later. Funds, as it stands right now, are yours to use between now and December 31st. But I do think that there would likely be some anxiety if we get into mid to late November and we have significant.
And I would concur with Jim, and I know some of the feedback we get in emails and phone calls is a lot of entities are saying they're going to wait until the end of the year to submit. I think it would be in everybody's best interest if you submit on a monthly or quarterly basis. It would allow us to review it quicker. It would make your filling out the reimbursement reform easier. And some of the problems we run into now is we're getting invoices, a large stack of reimbursement invoices that don't tie back to the actual amount in the reimbursement form, and that's where David's got to go back and work with the entities to help tie those things out. And until we actually have an application reimbursement form that actually gets met all those standards and ties out, we have the certification. We can't really say you're in queue for reimbursement for that 8 to 10 day turnaround. So,
go ahead.
I'd also say that there is a COVID committee. It's made up of leaders from around the state of Indiana that meets regularly once a week. I think they'll have some say on this also, along with OMB. I think the other goal of us doing this webinar with you all is some questions you all are going to ask. We can go back to this committee and see if we can, at least raise some of these issues with them to help them better understand some of the things you all are either requesting or struggling with.
One of the questions that has come up is regarding broadband development. Can the community use this money to help put in rural broadband, to help with e-learning, remote working, those kind of things? And I'll let you all answer that, but I know the CARES Act guidance from U.S. Treasury references this. So I just want to mention that for everybody that's on the phone, the U.S. Treasury puts out CARES Act guidance every few weeks, which is for those who get direct federal aid from the Treasury. Marion County received about $168 million. For all the other entities, your money is running through the IFA, and the state has put a few more conditions on it and restrictions at the moment. as Dan said, the committee will continuously review the request. But do you all have any general comments on the broadband development? And
Certainly, and thank you for pointing out not only the guidance, but the frequently asked questions that we, as you alluded to, keep getting updated from U.S. Treasury. The latest update we received was July 8th, which I believe was their third update. And they specifically mention rural broadband, and it is limited that they're only permitted if they are necessary because of the COVID-19 public health emergency. So the cost of the projects would be expected to be limited to enabling distance learning and telework as it is related to the COVID-19 health emergency. So the committee that Dan mentioned, that's managed by OMB, put together the 6 broad categories, essentially to enable us to quickly process what all believe to be expenses that many communities were associated with, and they'd be very quick for us to reimburse, which it has turned out that way. We can turn these in 8 to 10 days. When you start getting into the grayer areas, such as rural broadband, we would have to do an analysis and request additional information from a community looking to reimburse rural broadband to assure that it was A, directly related to the COVID-19 health emergency, and B, was not overreaching, and that perhaps that fix or upgrade had been in the hopper for some period of time. The Treasury, at least our reading of the guidance, they're looking for something that was triggered because of the health emergency, not something that was a need of the community prior to spring of this year.
I would add on, especially on the e-learning side, which would be for your schools. If you want to assist your school systems with that reimbursement request would have to, the schools would have to request it of you all, and then you all would have to submit it to us. The schools are not one of the 3 listed participants here. I do know the schools received a number of different funding from the CARES Act and the state. So that would be another kind of twist there. If it's e-learning related for schools, they'd have to request either the county, city, or town to fill out that reimbursement request on their behalf.
Another question was, what is the deadline for election expenses to be turned in? I want to make sure everybody knows that the Secretary of State's office had an appropriation, a reimbursement program for election expenses. And so I don't know what the deadline is for that. I'd have to go to the Secretary's website and see what that form looks like. But if you do have expenses for elections, I would go through the Secretary of State's office application first. And if for some reason you're denied there, then you may want to work with the county commissioners and seek reimbursement for a election-related expense. One of the questions is, what type of professional service fees are eligible for reimbursement through CARES Act?
As it stands today, and again, I'll refer back to the committee that Dan had referenced, because we've gotten this question several times, and our understanding is the committee is taking another look at this because it is somewhat restrictive as of today. If there is a professional expense directly related to the COVID-19 health emergency, and one example that we've had mentioned to us from either a legal or a financial professional, that as things were happening in April or May, questions were asked of their professionals, such as, what do we need to do to have a public meeting under the current environment? That would be an expense that is eligible. We've had requests from communities that would like to retain finance and legal professionals today in order to help them manage the paperwork, if you will, in order to work with FEMA and or us for CARES Act reimbursement. And at this point in time, that item of retaining a professional to help work through these processes is not eligible. But again, we have asked the committee to take another look at that, understanding that many communities are already understaffed and might not have the resources to take care of seeking reimbursement. With that said, we think our process is fairly straightforward. Even if outside professionals are retained, there's going to be the need for your staff to pull invoices, summarize, and document things. The one-page reimbursement request form is really pretty easy to fill out. But long-winded answer, we might have or hope to have an update on that. As Dan said, the committee meets weekly, and if there is additional flexibilities put into professional costs, we will certainly let everybody know.
An example that's come up for me would be so if a county attorney works so many hours for the county, and because of all the extra work the attorneys had to do to draft ordinances related to COVID, just do research, would those additional hours that the county attorney may charge the commissioners for legal work be reimbursable? It may all depend on how the contract was set up with the attorney, but can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Yes, it would.
I think it would be helpful there, county attorney either open up a separate account for COVID only, so the billing could be segregated, or provide a detailed bill where you all can isolate the actual work done by COVID, because a lot of your county attorneys might be on like a monthly retainer. We're going to need some details to support the actual work they did on COVID-19 and not broader work for the county, city, or town.
Okay. This is a question that came up about how a question on the form is phrased about it's a form asked about the expenditures not being accounted for in the most recent approved budget. They say it's a double negative. So I would answer yes. Is this correct? So if I'm turning in an expense for PPE, the answer is yes. It wasn't included in the budget, correct?
That's correct. And we've had, there has been some confusion with this, and rightly so, that communities have set their budgets. And of course, early in the year, they had substantial funding in their accounts in order to accommodate the payments that might have been unforeseen in March and April. And so we ask that you focus not necessarily on the money in the accounts, but the expense items that were budgeted. So if your traditional year of PPE is $5,000 and you spend $15,000, then the $10,000 above and beyond the 5 is what is outside of your budget. So it didn't matter the fact that you had $15,000 in your account to make that payment back in April doesn't mean that it would not be eligible for reimbursement. The $10,000 over and beyond the budgeted or anticipated $5,000 that you normally go through a PPE in a year, that would be eligible for reimbursement. So focus more on the category or the item rather than the available dollars in the budgeted accounts.
All right. I think the question related more to the wording of the form, where it says ask about the expenditures not being accounted for. So the answer would be yes.
Oh,
you think about switching the wording of that question maybe, or that comment?
We'll take a look at it.
Okay. Question comes up about if the county or a local unit is receiving the CARES Act money from the state, can they share that money with the nonprofit, and what would be the process for that? Not for another unit of government, but for a nonprofit.
Answer to that question is yes. And so the process would be that the not-for-profit would submit the invoice documenting the expense and the appropriate category for the expense to the city, town, or county. And then the county would submit that item either separately or along with their other expense items under the same category.
Right, and I would encourage the county, if they're going to submit for what I would call from a county subrecipient for a township, a library, a county created library, or a nonprofit, that they have some kind of documentation that the subrecipient, takes some liability if the money is not spent as reported to the county, just like the state's asking the counties to sign these agreements and participate in the program. The county should probably consider having a subrecipient from them to sign a similar form.
And or make sure the expense has been spent, meaning that the dollars are out the door, the invoice has been paid, so that the county as a sponsor and us as a reviewer are comfortable that A, the money's been spent, and B, it's been spent for the appropriate purpose.
Yeah, I think, for example, your soccer club within your county or city or town needs to spend 10 grand on PPE, plexiglass, and all those things. They should go out and purchase that on their own, provide you guys with a receipt, and if needed, documentation of payment. But the invoice is probably the best thing you can attach to a reimbursement form and make it a lot cleaner.
I do want to make clear, so if you do provide money to a subrecipient, that is part of the county's allocation, right?
Right.
I mean, that question was just asked. It's not a separate pot of money.
That is correct.
Right.
That's correct.
With legal expenses that the county has had to reimburse for people who won't stay in isolation. So the question is, we had to take individuals to court who are not staying in isolation. Would those legal expenses be covered?
I think yes. The probably the interesting thing for us is how that would be documented. But yeah, if there is a way to document that for us, then yes, it would be a expense directly related to the COVID-19 health emergency, and we would see that as reimbursable.
That gets into those areas that Jim talked about, that when the request comes in, we're probably going to have some follow-up questions on it to make sure we understand it. But glad to look at it.
Okay.
Or is it just
again?
Is it just related to the county? Is it just related to the county attorney filing paperwork on this individual? If that's the case, that's easy. But if you're looking for court costs and other things, that's going to get a lot more gray and difficult. If it's just the county attorney filing paperwork or taking action, that's an easy one, similar to them having to review your statute and tell you how you can have public meetings.
Okay, somebody asked a question, what fund are we to be using for the expenses and revenues? And then Julie Fox responded, 8,900 CARES, Provider Relief Fund. So that must be a Board of Accounts has already put that number out, I think. So hopefully that's correct.
That would be Board of Accounts question for sure. And if that's what Paul Joyce and his team gave you, that would be correct. Yeah,
I think it is. Julie responded, yep, that is the correct. It came from the Board of Accounts, so that's good. The questions are starting to slow down. I do just want to give one comment, or a couple of comments. Thank Dan and his team for doing this. Again, this is a huge undertaking. And I want to stress that not every state has allowed some of the CARES money to pass through to local units of government. Again, they didn't have to do that, and we're very appreciative that the administration allowed that to happen. And that the $300 million, about $180 million, I think, is allocated to counties and their major cities and towns. I do want to. There is an email that's in the PowerPoint presentation, so you can send in very specific questions and get responses. I think Jim said that within a day or two. If you want to make sure that something is going to be reimbursable, you can send a question into their email address, and they'll get back with you. And then I just want to touch again about this FEMA and CARES Act money. I know a lot of EMA directors have indicated that it's a longer and more detailed process, perhaps, to get reimbursement from FEMA. But again, I want everybody to understand if an expense is eligible from FEMA and CARES, you can spend you can get reimbursement from CARES for 100%, which comes out of your total, or you can turn it into FEMA, and the feds will pay 75% reimbursement, and then you use your CARES Act money as a local match, and that's only going to cost you 25%. So that's obviously going to stretch your CARES Act money much further into the future. And Dan mentioned, Congress comes back here in a couple of weeks, and I know NACO and other national organizations are working with Congress about extending the deadline for CARES Act money past the end of the calendar year. There's discussion about allowing the CARES Act money to be used for lost revenue. I don't know if they'll do that or not, but I'm just letting people know that that's on the table. And things continue to change, so I know everybody's in an awkward position of, do we want to turn everything in we can right now and get reimbursement from our CARES Act, because it might go away. The CARES Act money is not going to go away. It may become more flexible. But again, the situation you're in is the current law says you have to spend it by the end of the calendar year. Again, as Jim said, that probably means mid-November, if you're going to get reimbursement from that. So everything's still fluid, and I know it's concerning to counties to make sure they use this money to the best of their abilities. But I would definitely look at that FEMA CARES Act situation, try to stretch these dollars out, because we don't know when a vaccination becomes available if your health department will be expected to buy vaccines and use the CARES Act money for it, or if the feds will pay for that, or some other revenue source. So still a lot of things are changing constantly, and Treasury comes out with new guidance. But I just appreciate everybody's patience and continuous learning on this, because it's new for everybody. But I do think that the CARES Act program through the state is fairly simple reimbursement process, which we very much appreciate. So,
I think if I could add a couple of things, David, I think
yep.
The form, I would agree, is relatively easy. The instructions are easy, and it may be to get comfortable with it. Is my guess is most of your membership has probably purchased PPE and plexiglass and added cleaning equipment. That would be a very easy one to put together as a reimbursement request, send it over, and see how quickly we can respond and turn around payment to provide you with a comfort level of kind of dipping your foot into the water, so to speak. And then I think Pam has put up our website up there. You can see all the different drop-down menus. I'd encourage everybody to go out to our website. You've got frequently asked questions that we add to regularly. That's at the state level. You've got our certificate of participation for the CEO. We've got the reimbursement form and instructions. If you want to look at what your allocation is, it's out there. We've got helpful links that go out to the Fed website and other places. And then the last one we just added is COVID disbursements. That one provides details on what entities have been dispersed, how much, also in total, what's been dispersed by the 6 categories. And I think there's also out there a list of entities and whose certificates we've received and when, and so forth, that we're going to update on a regular basis also. So we try to make this as easy as possible. David Clark is there to answer your emails, your phone calls, and I think Jim is correct. He's generally given us grace for a weekend. He's generally pretty good about turning things around in 24 hours or less if you've got a question.
Lots of good comments. Appreciate your all's work on this. I know some of the individual counties you've had phone calls with, Hamilton County and Lake and others. So appreciate all your all's time for this. And the leadership of the Auditors Association, Julie and Patty Ball, are all commenting how much they appreciate everybody's work on this. There's a good question here. Expenses need to be paid by 12/31/2020 or invoiced only. So if we get to December 15th and somebody hasn't spent their entire allocation, but they won't get the paperwork in until after the end of the calendar year, will that still be reimbursed?
Yeah, unfortunately, current Treasury guidance requires the dollars to be out the door and paid. But we do know that, again, your national organizations are looking for some flexibility in that. And we're certainly hopeful that Congress affords us with some flexibility so that maybe that December 31st date becomes a cost is obligated, but as it stands today, it needs to be paid.
Okay, good to know. Again, I see Anton left on the call now from Owen County. Appreciate everything he's done on this issue and others. So everybody, again, is just continuing to learn about how all this is going to work out. But these slides will be available on our website. And again, you can always go directly to the IFA page. You can go to U.S. Treasury page and see their guidance on reimbursements. And then I'll put on our webpage the list of the 35 counties who have not sent in their applications yet to participate in this agreement. Again, maybe a few of those have changed over the last couple of weeks, and maybe even today. I know there's a lot of commissioner meetings today, so maybe some of the agreements got signed today. But I would definitely not leave this money sitting on the table, even though you may think you haven't had that many expenses to date. You don't know where this is going to end up in the next couple of weeks and months, so you would want to have that agreement in place. So when you do decide to turn in expenses, you'll get a quick turnaround time.
Dave, I want to thank you and your membership for allowing us to present today. And we hope David's phone line and email start getting very busy here in the next week or so. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.